Now that we have our HTML built out, let's create some CSS to make the form look a little bit better. I'm going to go into my main.css file, which is the file that we've been working on. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom of the page here, and I'll just make a CSS comment so that I know that this is where I'm going to start creating my form styles. And then we'll begin with the field set. So I'm going to use the field set selector, and then we're just going to set some padding, margin, and a border. I'm going to set padding all the way around for 1em just to push the content a little bit away from the edge of the field set. I'm going to set the margin on the top and the bottom. That will be set to 1em, and right and left it'll be 0. And then I'm going to set a border, and I'm just going to define my border to be a small white 1 pixel line that goes around the edge of the field set tag. If we save now and look in the browser, you can see how it already looks much better. Next, we're going to make a rule for the legend. And again, I'm going to set some padding on the legend on the top and the bottom. I'll set that to be 0, and on the right and the left, I'm just going to set it to be 5 pixels. I'm going to change my font style to be italic and set the color to be a shade of blue. So now the legend text will be styled accordingly. Looks like I forgot to put the legend down in this bottom field set. Let's fix that real quickly. Here's our last field set. I just failed to put the legend in there, so I'm just going to add that. It's going to say stay in touch. Okay, now we're going to create some styles for our labels. We'll set the width of the labels to be 175 pixels. I'm going to set the text align to be right, and I'm going to go ahead and set a color for these items. If we save and we look in the browser, you can see that now my labels are going to be styled in this manner. In addition to those rules, I'm going to tell them to vertically align to the top. You can see how down here in my text area box, by default the label goes to the baseline of the text box, and I want this to appear higher up. So I'm going to use a rule of vertical align and tell that to be top. That looks a little bit better because you can see it brings the question comment section up a little bit. Now if we look in the browser, you may or may not notice this, but because I know what my files should be doing, I realize that the width is not actually being properly represented, and that's because by default these label tags display as inline elements. So I'm going to go back into my CSS and I'm going to add a rule for a display of inline block. If we save and look in the browser now, you'll see that these get spaced out and they start to act like I would expect them to act. Now I'm going to make some rules for my input fields. And on the input fields, we're just going to set a little bit of margin on the right. That'll just create a little bit of space between the label and the input field itself. So you can see that just creates a little bit of additional spacing here. Now what I'd really like is I'd like the email address to actually be on its own line. I'm just going to add some HTML to format that. So I'm going to go back into my HTML, and up here at the top where we ask for the name and the email, in between the last name and the email, I'm just going to insert a paragraph tag, and this will insert that block level element that will force the email label and field to go on to the next line. I like the way that that looks a little bit better. Next, let's address our radio buttons right here. Let's get rid of the bullets, and we're also going to tell these to display as inline block. So because I gave these a special class name, I'm going to target them as UL space radio list so that it will only affect these unordered lists and not any others that I might have in my file. I'm going to set my list style type to none to remove the bullets, and then we'll set the display to be inline block. Next I'll format the radio list li elements, and these are going to display as inline, which will allow them to appear side by side, and then I'm going to create a margin on the right of 10 pixels. Alright, let's take a look at what this looks like now. You can see that now they appear in a list like so. This looks much better. And because our checkboxes were formulated with the same unordered list attributes, they're going to take on those styles as well. Next, we'll make a rule for our text area box. I'm going to tell this to have a width of 50%, and I'm going to tell it to have a height of 60 pixels. So that's just going to create some more spacing for this particular field to show up like this. So our form is coming along. Remember that we made this special class that we assigned to the or text right here. I'm now going to create a rule so that I can have this be styled a little bit differently than other items. The first thing that I want to do is I don't want quite as much spacing underneath or as the rest of the paragraph items. In order to do that, I'm going to target my p.or choice, which is the class name that we assigned to that particular paragraph. So if we look in here, you can see that the paragraph has a class of or choice. So I'm going to use that as a hook, and for that paragraph I'm going to tell the margin on the bottom to be 0. So I'll zero that out. That is being inherited from the regular rule that we already have on our p tags. Then I'm going to make a more specific selector, and for this I'm going to use my p.or choice, and then I'm going to select M. So this will select the M tag, which is the italic tag, and I'm going to set some margin settings, 10 pixels for the top, 0 for the right, 10 pixels for the bottom, and 100 pixels for the left. That's going to indent this text quite a bit. I'm going to set the font size to be a little bit smaller, so I'm going to use 0.9 ems, and I'm going to set the color of the text to be a different color altogether. Alright, if we save now and go back into the browser and refresh, my left margin is not showing up. Oops, I have a semicolon right there. Let's get rid of that. Alright, that looks a little bit better. So that is kind of where I want my or to be. Looks like actually this could use a tiny bit more spacing on the bottom. Let's go back into the rule that we already have. Maybe just add a little bit of spacing on the bottom. So I'm just going to go to the margin bottom, and let's just change this to maybe 4 pixels. That looks a little bit better. Now, because this label is longer than the other labels, you can see that it's wrapping, and what I'd like to do is I'd like this to actually not wrap onto a second line. Here's the label that I have for the newsletter. I am going to add a class to this as well of newsletter, and that's going to allow me to be able to style this uniquely. So when I go back into my CSS, and I'll stick this up here up on my other label rule, I'm going to make a rule for label.newsletter, and we'll overwrite the existing default style that we made that sets the width to 175 pixels, and we'll set the width to 250 pixels. So we're just going to give this label at the bottom a little bit more space. When I refresh now, you can see that now that text stays on one line, and that looks much better. And then the final thing that I want to do is I want to style my submit button. So I'm going to customize this submit button by putting some styles on that as well. I'll go down to the bottom and I'll make a rule for submit, and we'll set a margin on the left, padding, background color and text color, and then I'm going to use my border radius, which is one of our CSS3 selectors, just to give a little bit of rounding on the corners because this would be squared by default. Whenever we use border radius, we want to make sure that we include our vendor prefixes. And I'm going to set the border color to transparent because by default it will add a little bit of a border color, and I don't want that now that I've customized the button. So we'll save, and if we go back into our browser, looks like I forgot to add my hash mark right there. Remember that on the submit button we had assigned an ID of submit, and I just forgot to add the hash. So common mistake. I'll save again and we'll go into the browser. And now you can see that my button is being styled. I also want to make this look more like a button, so let's add one more rule to the submit section, and let's set the cursor to be the pointer. That looks a little bit better. Now people will have feedback that that is a link. And if I click my button, you can see that it's going to ask me to fill out this field. So I would need to fill out this field, And if I click this button again, it's going to ask me to fill out the next field. These fields are required. We probably want to give our user a little bit of feedback as to which fields are actually required. So in order to do that, I'm going to add that into the HTML. And the only fields that we said were required were these first three. So after the input field appears, I'm just going to have a little asterisk show. So now you can see there's an asterisk. And hopefully that would give people a clue that these fields are required and that they would need to fill these out in order for the form to properly submit. We could also add more robust feedback. If we were to incorporate some JavaScript or something like that, we could actually have it display a message, or we could just write required here. So you have a lot of different capabilities available to you just depending on what you want to do on the form. Anyways, in a nutshell, that is how you can build and style a form. And this just gives you an overview of some of the most commonly used form elements.